And that's what they'll tell you tomorrow. So let's see, when I asked Mr. Phillips, he says, do you want the truth or what I testified to? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, that is just totally inappropriate. Is he now admitting that he's testified to false things? And now he's going to tell the truth? I mean, what is it? All right. Overuse of prescription drugs by you for doctors is known. Elvis Presley, we know about him. Dr. Nick, we heard about him. Mr. Gongaware, and he knew, so AEG knew the history of MJ's tours. Yes, I believe so. AEG knew the problems, didn't they, sir? Yes. The problems, we know the problems included prior use of pain meds and opiate addiction, correct, sir? I don't know how to classify opiates, but he did admit he had a problem with painkillers. There's no dispute in this case. But Mr. Gongaware, he wouldn't even admit it that one of his best friends, Dr. Finkelstein, who he tried to offer the job for $40,000, called him on the phone and told him during the prior tour. He wouldn't admit that, and his best friend had to come say that he had. Dr. Metzger, he talked about the plan on the dangerous tour. And he talked about the plan was not a good plan, and what happening was they're mixing the pain meds, the sleep meds, in a vicious cycle, and the tour was canceled to Mexico City, and Michael went into rehabilitation, made the public announcement. No dispute, and it wasn't working. Here's Dr. Finkelstein, a very good friend of Mr. Gongaware's.
Well, did you inform Mr. Gongaware of the situation with the artist?
Yes, sir.
And what did you tell Mr. Gongaware in regard to the situation with the artist?
I said, I think we're going to have a problem.
And did you elaborate on that?
I'm going to say yes, but I wouldn't know exactly what I said.
Well, did you tell Mr. Gongaware you thought that Mr. Jackson had a dependency on opiates?
Yes.
He answered the questions. He didn't say, I don't remember. I can't recall that, but he answered.
And what did Mr. Gongaware say to you?
He said, don't be a Dr. Nick.
And by Dr. Nick, was he talking about Elvis?
Yes, sir.
And who is Dr. Nick?
I don't remember his last name, but he was Elvis's doctor, and I think Elvis died with like 14 different chemicals in his system, and he's kind of warning me that, don't get all infatuated where you start administering meds to a rock star and have the rock star overdose and die on you.
Mr. Gongaware knew that long before Michael Jackson was contracted.
And did you ever discuss with Mr. Gongaware your thoughts on how you could perhaps, help Michael get better?
We would have had that discussion with Dr. Forecast.
And do you remember what was discussed?
We felt that we needed to do an intervention. He needed to be detoxed.
Dr. Finkelstein is an addiction specialist. Mr. Gongaware called him to go on the tour for 40, asked him what he would charge. He said $40,000, and he never heard back after 5 calls. Debbie Rowe talked about Dr. Forecast, how she wanted to confront Dr. Forecast, and the management people from the tour wouldn't let her. And we asked Mr. Gongaware, if Michael has a doctor that's giving him medications and doing things that could jeopardize his health, that's bad, isn't it? It's bad for if anyone is giving him drugs. So he knew or should have known about this potential problem. Mr. Trell, he agreed that AEG would not want to hire a doctor whose role it is to supply drugs without regard to medical standards. It's obvious, of course, Mr. Trell would admit that. No reasonable concert promoter or producer would hire a personal physician for a doctor. They're not in that position. No one does it. That's not a reasonably careful producer or promoter. They just don't do that. And even Dr. Early, and we went round and round about Dr. Early and conflicts of interest and failure to disclose and his prior criminal history and the doctor that he hired, that the former doctor with him who had his license suspended on the study that was funded by AEG. Remember all that?
So then it probably was not a good idea, sort of paradoxically, that he had a full-time 24-hour doctor with him, correct?
I think that having a doctor with him who has a prescription pad can be a high-risk situation unless properly prepared for it in someone that's chemically dependent.
Dr. Lee admitted it. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, don't leave your common sense behind. It's obvious. It's a serious problem. And of course, Mr. Berman said he's never heard of anyone doing this, whether an artist says it or not. Hire the doctor. Nobody does it. Mr. Trell, he's never, as a producer, AEG Live has never agreed to retain a doctor for an artist. Never. Miss Hollander, never. Mr. Gongaware.
Based on your experience as you sit here today, can you name any other time when, in your role as, while you're working on a tour as a producer, that you called a physician on behalf of an artist and attempted to negotiate a price for that physician to go on tour with the artist?
No.
Is it a fair statement that this was the only time in your career that you've ever done this?
Yes.
That's not being reasonably careful. And Mr. Phillips, the same thing. He's never been involved in a situation like this. And they knew or should have known that Michael needed treatment for insomnia, not for cardiac. And in fact, Dr. Metzger talked about how he had spoken to Mr. Gongaware in the first leg of the prior tour and discussed the sleep problems with him, but that's not the only one. In fact, Dr. Metzger prepared a sleep protocol, so to speak, for Mr. Jackson. Everybody knew that he had problems sleeping. He needed sleep. In fact, he said there were many problems with dangerous that he was concerned about. And then Travis Payne, remember Travis Payne, the dancer that they called out of order because he was going to be out of the country, and he came up and he had the MJ, what you call it, epilepsy, I think it's called, on his sleeves, and he said he knew Michael had a problem sleeping for many years, and Mr. Ortega, he thought, knew that too, and it was his understanding that Murray was there to treat him for sleep, and he didn't know what kind of medicine was being given. He's just the choreographer, but he was involved. Remember, he said he went to MJ's house sometimes to work with them. He knew what was going on, and Mr. Phillips told us, I asked him, you told us when you testified under oath that Mr. Ortega was concerned and raised it with you and Dr. Murray that Michael wasn't getting enough sleep. Was that truthful testimony? Yes. So Mr. Phillips knew that, and Mr. Payne knew that, and Mr. Ortega knew that. It's not some big surprise. And Dr. Seisler, the sleep medicine or sleep specialist, said, by the way, even if you clean somebody up and have them, put on makeup, do everything else, the average person can recognize that somebody has been sleep deprived, but not just in 2 or 3 seconds by a photograph of them, even if they'd taken a shower and cleaned up, because we can just tell from the appearance. You don't need a doctor to tell you this. Michael deteriorated for 60 days. Everyone saw it. It was documented, and it's obvious. In their own videos, it shows how he has an obvious deterioration. Remember, he's the greatest, and I'm not one to judge that, but the testimony is he was the greatest of all time. And even him, in a bad state, could look good, but they knew that he was having problems. They knew it. In fact, Mr.
What does AEG Live do to supervise independent contractors who work on tours? Well, they engage the independent contractors to perform certain services. So to the extent those parties are or are not providing those services in a manner meeting with the satisfaction of tour director, tour manager, etc., I guess to that extent there's some level of oversight of the services that they're rendering. I mean, somebody is making note of whether or not what independent contractor is doing and whether or not that's meeting with the expectation.
So I think what Mr. Trell is trying to say is that somebody is supposed to be watching out how they're doing. And that person, who was it? Well, according to Mr. Gongaware, it was Kenny Ortega. He said Kenny Ortega was there to monitor Michael's health, everything. He was the director. He was supposed to monitor everything, including Michael's health, okay? So as Mr. Trell said, somebody was there to do it. So what did Mr. Ortega do when he saw the problem? He was there every day. He was in a good position to assess Michael. He was closest to the man. That's right. That's what Mr. Ortega was, according to Mr. Gongaware. And then, so what does Mr. Ortega do? He says, stay on top of the health situation. Talk with the doctor. Make sure MJ's getting everything he needs. And then we get to the 6th, the 15th. Michael didn't come on, had a bad day on Friday, didn't come on Sunday. He needs attention and management. He's sounding the alarms. He mentioned that he believes he needs nourishment and guidance. This is Kenny saying this. For his fatigued muscles, shape, he's hurting. We need a healthy, resting MJ. The pressure was building up. And Mr. Ortega told you the pressure was building up. They're leaving for London in 3 to 4 weeks. The pressure was on. There had been discussions of whether they're going to pull the plug. And the pressure was on Michael. It was on Mr. Ortega. And they, AEG Live, put it on Dr. Murray. And how did they do that? Well, first of all, Mr. Hoogdahl, who works now for Shania Twain, I believe, in Las Vegas. I believe it was an AEG production. I'm not positive. But Mr. Hoogdahl, he didn't come in here to testify. But Mr. Hoogdahl wrote this email, said MJ was sent home without stepping foot on stage. He was a basket case. That was explained by Dr. Matheson, what a basket case is. And Kenny was concerned that Michael would embarrass himself. And the company was rehearsing, but doubt was pervasive. Everybody knew there was a problem. And Randy Phillips sends that email directly to Mr. Lewicki, the CEO of AEG, parent company, the man that couldn't remember anything. And he writes, we have a real problem here. It's not Michael might have a fever. We have a real problem. We, not Michael, not we, AEG has a real problem. And of course, then Mr. Lewicki wrote back and wanted to know if they wanted to go some ball that night. And Mr. Gongaware says that Mr. Hoogdahl was there viewing Michael every day, trustworthy and honest, and he wasn't a drama queen. So here's a man who's there every day, reports to Mr. Gongaware and Phillips that there's a problem. Were they reasonably careful in the supervision and retention of Dr. Murray at this time? No. They didn't do anything reasonable at that time. Then, Kenny says, this is on the 19th, Michael's shaking, couldn't hold his knife and fork. Kenny cut his food before he could eat. He had to use his fingers. And this is sent to Randy Phillips and Paul Gongaware, the two top people on this project. It's not sent to some lower person that's not getting the word out. And then, Randy Phillips writes back and says, Tim and I, that's Mr. Lewicki, are going to see him tomorrow. However, I'm not sure what the problem is, chemical or physiological. And do you remember Mr. Phillips, I don't know if I have it in here, said, when we asked him, what did you mean by chemical? I don't know. I don't remember. It's pretty obvious, ladies and gentlemen, what he meant, because Mr. Gongaware wrote back, take the doctor with you. Why wasn't he there? The doctor that they never hired, that they never supervised, they say, they never retained, he says, take him there. Why wasn't he there? That's Mr. Gongaware's writing. And it's interesting, what is the topic of these emails? Trouble at the front. Now, is that knowing or should have known? Trouble at the front? Is that putting you on notice that there's a problem? It doesn't say questions about rehearsal, questions about costumes. It says trouble at the front. Now, you would think if you're running a big project like that and you receive an email that says trouble at the front, that you might read it. That would be a reasonably careful person would do that. Trouble at the front. And then they go on. And Mr. Phillips says, he's not a psychiatrist, so I'm not sure how effective he can be. Obviously, that's not the issue. It's much deeper. So Mr. Phillips here is questioning whether Dr. Murray is fit and competent for this specific risk and incident. He knows. He's not new or should know. He knows. He's stating it. And then what happens? Mr. Ortega, and I believe Mr. Ortega was trying to help his friend Michael Jackson. And Mr. Ortega didn't want anything bad to happen to Michael, and I believe that. And he says, now that we've brought the doctor into the fold, remember that Dr. Madison talked about sheep coming in the fold, I think. Played the tough love card, now or never, is that the artist may be unable to rise to the occasion due to real emotional stuff. He appeared quite weak and fatigued, terrible case of chills, trembling, rambling, obsessing. Everything says he should be psychologically evaluated. And Mr. Bronco said another email, I don't know, I'm going to show it, but you know, I know a substance abuse counselor who treated Michael Tyson and on and on. So there's communication. But what happens? Well, Mr. Ortega writes further. The choreographer that during the artist's costume fitting noticed that Michael has lost more weight. There's no one taking responsibility caring for him on a daily basis. Feeding him, wrapping him in blankets to warm his chills. This is what he had to do, massage his feet, and calling his doctor. He's terribly frightened it'll all go away. Was somebody being reasonably careful in supervising and retaining with all this information? I don't think so. In fact, what does Mr. Phillips, he gets another email. By the way, Elif Sankey, she told Mr. Phillips, or excuse me, Elif Sankey told Mr. Ortega, she thought Michael was going to die. She was right. And Karen Fay said she's going to die. She was right. And Kenny said, I don't know if he's going to make it. I don't think he's ready. He was right. But what happened? Kenny says, I don't think he's ready. Reminiscent of the problem things, I think get him to the psychiatrist. We need professional guidance. So when Mr. Phillips receives that email for the King of Pop, so when they put out all this money, all these shows, they sold out in record time, what does he do? Well, Mr. Shrell said, this would be something that you should delve into for sure. That's reasonable. That's what a reasonably careful person would do. And if Mr. Trell had been there, he might have done that, but he wasn't. He wasn't involved in this. But the people in charge, they didn't delve into it. What did they do? Well, this is the symptoms that we knew. Travis Payne, Michael was too thin, not eating enough, concerned about weight change, concerned he was fatigued, lethargic during rehearsals. Elif Sankey, choreographer, she was concerned at the end of May. She cried because Michael didn't look good and said God was talking to him. Michael is dying. He's dying. He needs to be put in the hospital. Kenny said he'll look into it. He'll handle it. Karen Fay believed that there was a risk that MJ dying. She was extremely concerned about his psychological well-being and being paranoid. And Michael Bush said that when Michael was in the back, he said, oh my God, I could see his heart beating through his chest. He was so thin. And Mr. Bugsy Hookdahl watched Michael deteriorate for 8 weeks in front of his very eyes. And Mr. Bearden said he wasn't prepared to sing and dance everything at the same time, late in time. And what happens? Kenny sees him cold, emaciated, afraid, all these complaints. And what happens? Kenny Ortega had a concern about Dr. Murray. Kenny said, I really didn't know what Dr. Murray did, but Michael was showing up in this condition. I had a concern. And you had a real concern about Dr. Murray at this time and his work as a professional for Michael. Yes, he, remember now that thing, legal relationship, he's the agent of AEG. If he knows, they know. He knew, he had a concern. Now, he's not a doctor, but here's this guy that's allegedly treating Michael, and he's looking like this. It's not working, okay? That's not being reasonably careful. It's not working. So what happens? Kenny says, he didn't think that Dr. Murray was providing good care to Michael. And in fact, he thought Dr. Murray, that a different doctor should have been brought in to check it out. That's what he believed, the person in charge of the day-to-day operations. And he relayed that to the CEOs of AEG Live. And then Mr. Phillips gets involved again. And what does Mr. Phillips do? He writes back to all these people and says, oh, we had a very productive, solid meeting with Kenny, Murray, MJ, and myself. Doctor was fantastic. I think Kenny's hysteria will be in check. While MJ was alert and attentive, we all agreed on a schedule that works for KO and MJ. I promised Kenny I'll be in the office next week at Staples. Let's pray Kenny engages and starts to work out and eat. And MJ, I'm sorry. And things aren't as bleak as what Kenny says. So Kenny writes all these emails, these other hoop doll, and everybody's weighing in. And Mr. Phillips gets involved, and what does he do? He pours water on everything. Oh, it's not as bleak as Kenny says. The doctor's fantastic. Really? How do you know that? Well, let's look at it. That's what Michael looked like in their own video. Look at his Adam's apple here. That's what Michael looked like. So then, the moment of the trial, Mr. Phillips is up there. I show him this picture, Exhibit 8-54, and I said, June 20th, Michael looked great. He was fine. Well, then, here he is on June 19th getting fitting. How do you explain that, Mr. Phillips? And he stammered around and said, well, he had his hair, makeup. He didn't look like that on the 20th. What changed in 12 hours? I don't know. I didn't see him on that date. I have no idea. And then I said, oh, so what did you do, give him those protein shakes? I was just as confused as anyone, because the Michael I expected to see based on his email would have been this Michael Jackson. That's who it was. But he didn't want to see anything else but get the show going forward. And I said, how do you explain that someone looks like this and 12 hours later you tell everyone they look great? How do you explain that? Well, we go behind the scenes. That's the evidence. You dispute that? No, there's a problem on June 19th, but 12 hours later, everything's fine. Less than 12 hours, actually. Remember Mr. Seneff? He came to the house 5 days later, said that Michael's very, very underweight. You could see his ribs. He was ill. He looked like he's at the end stage of a disease process. And then he asked, is there a DNR? Which means when people are dying, they issue these do not resuscitate orders, and the paramedics come in and they want to do what the patient wants. So they ask, because there's steps they can take to try to revive the person, but some people say, I don't want that. So Mr. Seneff asked that, and Mr. Seneff thinks that he looks like a hospice patient. Okay? So then we have two descriptions by Mr. Ortega. First, on the 20th, Mr. Ortega writes at 1:48 in the afternoon. He had trouble at the front again. He writes to Kenny Ortega. Remember, this is after all Kenny's emails. And he says, Kenny, it's critical that either you or me or anyone become amateur psychiatrist or physician. I had a lengthy conversation with Dr. Murray, who I'm gaining immense respect for. I'm going to deal with him more. He said Michael's is not only physically equipped to reform, discourage him would hasten his decline instead of stopping it. So he again knows that Michael's on a decline. Well, you remember I asked him that. He said, well, I didn't really mean that. Hasten doesn't really mean that, and blah, blah, blah. And then he says, this doctor is extremely successful, parentheses, we check everyone out, and he doesn't need, this gig, he's totally unbiased and ethical. Wow. Where did he get that? Well, after saying 3 times he doesn't remember writing it, we show him other evidence. And we know that they can cancel or postpone the tour at any time. We got Mr. Ortega sounding all these alarms, the big meeting called up at Carrollwood, Phillips, the doctor, Kenny is summoned up there, get up here. And what happens? Murray was going to keep the show going on. And so what does Mr. Phillips write? Well, actually, I skipped one here. But this is the same email. Let me go back. So he writes then, at 13 minutes later, he writes to Gongware and Hoopdal and Liwicki, and Gongware, the CEO of AEG, he writes to him and says, he's not a psychiatrist, so I'm not sure how effective he can be. Obviously, get him there is not the issue. It's much deeper. So he tells Mr. Ortega that he's checked him out, everything's fine, and 13 minutes later, he tells the CEO and the people, I'm not sure how effective he can be. Now, what is it, Mr. Phillips? Is it you're not sure how effective he can be, which you're telling the people you work with? Or is it he's fantastic, doesn't need the gig, totally unbiased and ethical, like you're telling the person that's trying to be reasonably careful? What is it? Well, what it is a conflict. They wanted the show to keep going. And of course, he says this amateur physician's immense respect. You've probably seen that so many times. And what does their expert say about it, Mr. Hahn?
Sir, under what circumstances would you tell a show director that you did a check on the artist's doctor when you really didn't do a check on the artist's doctor?
I would never tell a show director that.
Right, you would never tell a show director who's expressing concern about the artist's well-being an untruth about a check that you did on the artist's doctor, correct?
Correct.
Because a reasonably careful person would never do that. It's a flat-out lie, misrepresentation, and cover-up. That's what it is. Why did he do that? Because he didn't care. Then, before the meeting, there's a call between Mr. Phillips and Dr. Murray. And remember in his deposition he said, it was very short, 2 minutes. Then we break out the records and we determine that it was 20-some minutes. And he was talking about what information for the rehearsals the night before. So he's prepping up Dr. Murray for the meeting with Ortega. And then he writes to Ortega the email saying everything's fine after he talks to him. And then they have the meeting. And what happens at the meeting? Is it a meeting where they, Dr. Murray's going to say, look, we're in this and that? No. What happened at the meeting was that Kenny was told that everything was fine. And I said, how did you react to that? I was flabbergasted. I didn't believe it was possible. That's a reasonably careful person. But then Mr. Phillips said, or Dr. Murray was accusing him of being an amateur psychiatrist, and it was everything that was in the email after he spoke to Dr. Murray. And interestingly enough, they knew or should have known of the financial condition. Ms. Seawright talked about when you're giving medical care in a home, you have access to confidential information. It's a higher risk position. When you elevate the risk, you should do more about it. And they knew. They knew, but they never did anything until Michael was dead. And then he still admitted they hired him, and then all of a sudden everything started with the lawyers. Now, she also talked about financial distress can impact ethical judgments and decision making. So, what is it? Mr. Trell, we don't do background checks on independent contractors, or Mr. Phillips, we check everyone out. Which one is it?
Now, AEG Live could do a background check and could do a credit check on hires who do contract work, correct?
Theoretically, yes. AEG Live could do background checks on independent contractors.
And credit checks?
Theoretically, to the extent credit checks are lawful, AEG Live could undertake to do one.
All they had to do is have them sign the authorization, which they had, which the LAPD officer said they could have done. Mr. Gongor, we'll ask him what.
Have you learned since that time that anybody at AEG Live ever conducted any sort of background check into Dr. Murray?
I don't know of anybody that did.
And does that concern you in any way?
No.
No. At any time, up until the day before, no one did anything over this 8-week decline. They did nothing. And they chose to gamble and they lost. Now, the answer to that question, number 3, should be yes. Number 4, did Dr. Murray's unfitness harm Michael Jackson? I mean, come on, obviously. But the answer to that is clearly yes. Clearly, The death was not due to natural cause or disease, as Dr. Rogers said. The amount of propofol was excessive. Benzodiazepines, all that Dr. Murray had given, was the cause of Michael Jackson's death. It should never have been done that way. He clearly caused Michael Jackson's death, acting incompetently. And in fact, that's what Dr. Rogers, the coroner, said. And Dr. Woolagardner said that the departures from the standard care on Dr. Murray were a substantial factor in causing Michael Jackson's death. And there's been no evidence in this case to the contrary. No one said it didn't, because it's obvious that it did. I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. That's easy, number 4. Number 5 is, was AEG Live's negligence in hiring or supervising or retaining Conrad Murray a substantial factor in causing Michael Jackson and the plaintiff's harm? The answer to that is yes. Why? First, look at the instruction. Again, we're back to that reasonable person. It's harm that a reasonable person would consider to have contributed. It doesn't have to be the only harm. It's not the sole harm. It's not the exclusive harm. It's not the one and only. If you think Michael Jackson contributed, that could be part of it. Dr. Murray, that's part of it. But Dr. Murray, if you find he was hired and they were negligent, his fault is attributed to them, AEG Live. Michael's fault, if any, you have to assess separately. So just because one person's at fault doesn't mean others cannot be. I hope I said that right. And here's an instruction that says it. A person's negligence may combine with another factor to cause harm. If you find AEG's negligence supervising, hire, retaining Murray was a substantial factor, then AEG is responsible. AEG Live cannot avoid responsibility just because some other person, condition, or event was a substantial factor, like Michael Jackson using pain medications, like Dr. Murray violating the standard of care. That's not an offense to AEG Live in this case. That's the law. Now, we know that Dr. Murray treated Michael Jackson 7 times in 3 years, although they continue to call him his longtime personal physician. Okay? 7 times over the years, and his kids a few times for urinary or upper respiratory infection, URI, sorry. Cough, fungal, anyway. Insomnia twice. But he gave him no propofol at any time. Then we know this whole situation here. Michael's doing his whole life, all the way up to Thriller, he's Burned, the history tour, all the way down here to 2000. He has lupus, we heard all about that in '93, burn injuries, vitiligo, dangerous tour, history tour, gets Demerol and Percocet for scalp injuries, Dr. Suzuki, back injury, remember the thing collapsed in Munich, I think it was. Okay, he gets propofol 31 times for all surgeries, procedures, plastic surgeries, except the 2 times in Munich with the 2 doctors that were set up there by Metzger and Debbie Rowe. No problem. Never a single issue until AEG wants to give Murray money, and they get Murray, and in 60 days, he lives 50 years, no problem. In 60 days, he has a rapid decline, he's dead. And what is the one thing that changed? AEG and Murray and the contract. Never happened before. You know, they want to say, oh, he's an abusing propofol. Well, there's no expert testimony that said he's addicted to propofol. They want to say that, and they showed all those videos, and he had it for this procedure and that procedure. He did, okay, great. He didn't like pain, you know. As Dr. Metzger says, he's like a baby, but, you know, you take him as you find him. Everybody has different pain thresholds, and they want to get up here and criticize him for that. Let them walk in his shoes. Then we get into this whole chart that they put up, Exhibit 1129. Propofol in Germany, no problem. Ask Quinn, Van Valen. He doesn't ask Adams, he asks him to help him sleep. And Murray, he asks